The night had fallen, wrapping the house in its heavy embrace. The wind howled through the gaps in the old wooden walls, the trees outside groaning under the pressure of the storm. Inside, everything seemed frozen in time, silent, except for the soft crackling of the fire. But something about the stillness felt wrong, like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And I was waiting too, but I didn't know what for. Our family always gathered at my uncle and aunt's house in Pennsylvania for Thanksgiving, a tradition that had been in place for as long as I could remember. It was a time for warmth, for laughter, for memories. But this year was different. Their house, this old, creaking mansion nestled in the woods, had always had an air of mystery about it, but this time it felt like something darker lingered within its walls. There were no cell phones, no internet, no way to communicate with the outside world. Just us, and the house. The house that had always made me feel uneasy, but tonight, it felt like something else was watching us, something that didn't belong. We were gathered in the living room, the smell of cinnamon and pine filling the air. The fire cast long shadows on the walls, flickering and dancing, but those shadows felt different tonight, longer, darker. My family was busy with preparations, talking and laughing as usual. But then there was Kelsey, my cousin. She was standing at the door, her back to the room, her gaze distant and vacant, her face twisted into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I had always known Kelsey as the quiet one, the one who would rather observe than participate. But this was something else. It wasn't just her silence, it was the way she stood there, her body rigid, her eyes blank. I tried to call out to her, to ask if everything was okay, but she didn't respond. Instead, she just stared ahead, her smile stretching unnaturally across her face, too wide, too forced. It was as if she didn't recognize me or anyone else in the room. I shook it off, telling myself it was nothing. She was probably just tired, or maybe she was lost in her own thoughts. But as the night wore on, that nagging feeling at the back of my mind grew stronger. It wasn't just her silence, it was the way she moved, or rather, the way she didn't. Every time I glanced over at her, she would tilt her head slightly, as if something had caught her attention, something I couldn't see. It made my skin crawl. After dinner, we gathered around the fireplace, playing a board game as we always did. Everyone was talking and laughing, but not Kelsey. She remained seated by the fire, her eyes fixed on the flames, her expression vacant, her body unmoving. It was as though she had become part of the room itself, an object rather than a person. And then, every so often, she would shift her gaze, slowly, deliberately, as though she were watching something just beyond the walls. Something I couldn't see. That night, after the others had gone to bed, I decided to get a drink of water. As I passed down the hall, I saw her again. Kelsey was standing in the dark, staring into the nothingness. There was no sign of her usual self, no trace of the cousin I once knew. She didn't respond when I called her name, didn't even acknowledge me. She just stood there, her head slowly turning toward me, her eyes glassy and distant. And then, in a voice that wasn't quite hers, she whispered, "Do you hear it?" I froze. "Hear what?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. Instead, she stared at me with those empty eyes and said in a tone that chilled me to my core, "It's coming." I backed away slowly, the weight of her words pressing on my chest. What was she talking about? What was coming? And why did it feel like she wasn't even the one speaking? It was as if something else had taken hold of her, something that had replaced the Kelsey I once knew. The next morning, things only worsened. Kelsey sat at the breakfast table, not touching her food. Her eyes were fixed on the empty chair at the end of the table, her gaze unwavering, as if she was waiting for someone or something to sit there. It was an eerie sight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, in the middle of breakfast, she stood up without a word, walked over to the empty chair, and muttered something under her breath. "It's your turn." I blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer. She simply returned to her seat, sitting down as though nothing had happened, her expression blank. But then I noticed something strange. A dark stain had appeared on the chair she had walked to, a stain that seemed out of place. It wasn't there before. It wasn't there when she stood up. And yet, when I looked again, it was gone. It vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving no trace behind. Throughout the day, the unease continued to build. Kelsey was there, but she wasn't. Her smile was too wide, her laughter too hollow. And every time I glanced at her, she was staring at that empty chair again, as though she was waiting for someone to take a seat. But it wasn't just an empty chair, it was something more. It was as if the space itself was waiting for something to fill it. As we sat down for dinner that night, I could barely focus on the conversations around me. Everyone seemed oblivious to the tension in the room, the weight of something unspoken. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something had taken Kelsey away and left something else in her place. And as I looked around the table, I realized that whatever had happened to her, whatever had taken hold of her, was sitting at the table with us. It was at that moment that I understood the truth. The house was not just haunted by the past, it was haunted by what was still there, waiting. And it wasn't just Kelsey who had changed. The house itself had become something else. Something was watching us. Something that had been here long before we ever arrived. As the night wore on, I realized that this wasn't just a warning, it was a message. A message to those who would come after us. To anyone who would step into this house, who would gather around that table. To anyone who would ignore the signs, who would dismiss the feeling of being watched, who would try to explain away the strange happenings. Do not ignore the signs. Do not dismiss the cold feeling that creeps up your spine when the house goes silent. Do not brush off the strange whispers in the dark, the vacant stares, the inexplicable changes. The house is alive, and it watches. It listens. And it waits for you to make the same mistake we did. If you hear the whispers, if you see the empty chair, if you feel the cold air around you, understand this: you are not alone. Something is watching, something is waiting. And it is not always what it seems. It had been a year since that strange encounter at my uncle's house in Missouri. A year since everything had felt normal, yet everything had been completely wrong. The summer barbecue was a tradition, something my family always did, simple, easy, and full of laughter. The kind of event where you expect nothing unexpected to happen. But this time, it was different. It was the kind of difference that lingered like a bad taste you couldn't shake off, no matter how hard you tried. The sun shone warmly down on us, the smell of charred meat and fresh vegetables drifting on the breeze. People were laughing, talking, playing with the kids, just enjoying the day. The house was alive with the sounds of chatter and clinking glasses, the usual noises of a large family gathering. I should have felt at ease, comfortable, but instead, there was this gnawing sensation in the pit of my stomach, something primal that I couldn't explain. And then he appeared. Eli. He was standing at the edge of the yard, out of place, like he'd just materialized from the dense forest behind the house. He didn't smile, didn't wave, just stood there watching us. No one had invited him. No one knew him. But he was there, as if he had always belonged. His clothes were unremarkable, just casual, plain clothes, but there was something about his stillness, his lack of movement, that caught my attention. It was like he wasn't just part of the landscape, he was the landscape. Detached, disconnected, watching everything unfold without ever truly engaging in it. At first, I thought he was just another eccentric relative who had shown up unannounced. But as the minutes dragged on, I could sense something was off about him. He had the air of someone who didn't just know us, he seemed to own us. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the discomfort in my chest grew with every second he stood there. Eventually, someone from the family walked over to greet him, awkward smiles, cautious handshakes, but even in those brief moments, I could tell no one was comfortable. We all felt it. That unspoken tension that hung in the air like smoke. Eli didn't help matters when he started speaking. His words were too precise, too sharp. He talked about our family like he had been there for every moment, every dinner, every quiet Sunday afternoon. He knew everything from the way my mother liked to make her pies, to the old stories my grandfather used to tell us. These weren't things you could learn from being around for just a few minutes. These were details only someone who had been with us would know. And that's when it clicked. I realized something about Eli wasn't just strange, it was impossible. I had never seen him before. No one had. And yet, he knew us better than we knew ourselves. His words were laced with familiarity, like someone who had been a constant presence in our lives, even though we had no memory of him. The more he spoke, the more uncomfortable I became. The family tried to brush it off, to act as if everything was fine, but I could see it in their eyes. They were as unsettled as I was. It was in the way they glanced at each other when he wasn't looking, in the way the conversation slowly died down whenever he joined in. After the party, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Eli's presence had haunted me, had lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. I needed to know more. The next morning, I began looking through old family photographs, hoping to find something that would make sense of this. That's when I stumbled upon the picture. A faded, almost forgotten photo from a barbecue years ago. And there he was, right in the middle of the group, smiling, laughing, part of the crowd. But the longer I stared at it, the more wrong it felt. His face, his eyes, everything was wrong. He didn't belong in that photo. He didn't belong in our family. Confused, I turned to the family records. Maybe there was something I had missed, some explanation for this stranger who seemed so familiar, yet so foreign. When I looked through the family archives, that's when I saw it, Eli's name. Listed in the family registry as an adopted member in 1954. But he wasn't just a part of the family. He was listed as a child, someone who had been taken in long before I was born. The problem? He looked the same. In the photos I had seen of him at the barbecue, he looked the same as he did now. The same. He shouldn't have looked like that. I felt the air in the room shift as I absorbed what I had just read. A man who had been adopted into our family over 60 years ago yet still looked the same age as he did then. How was that possible? How could someone remain frozen in time, never aging? The questions spiraled in my mind, each one more disturbing than the last. A few days later, I found something else. In the attic, buried beneath old journals and boxes of forgotten knickknacks, I discovered an old notebook that had been kept by my grandmother. As I flipped through its pages, I found a name written in the margins: Eli. It wasn't much, just a few notes: his adoption, his arrival into the family, but there was something else. A line that made my blood run cold. It said, "Eli is not what he seems. Watch him closely." The words echoed in my head as I realized that no one else in the family had ever mentioned this. No one else had ever spoken of Eli the way my grandmother had. The words were a warning. And now, I understood why. The next morning, when I went to find him, he was gone. Just like that. Vanished. No one saw him leave, no one heard him go. It was as if Eli had never been there at all. But the house felt different. The air felt heavier. And as I stood in the quiet of that room, I could hear my grandmother's warning echoing through my thoughts: watch him closely. I didn't know what Eli was, or why he had come into our lives, but I understood one thing now. Some people, some things, are never meant to be fully understood. They exist just on the edges of our awareness, always watching, always waiting. And sometimes, it's better not to ask too many questions. To those who come after me, looking for answers in the shadows of this story, remember this: some mysteries are best left unsolved. Some things are not meant to be known. When you feel that gnawing unease, when you see something that doesn't belong, don't try to fit it into your world. Walk away. Some questions, once answered, leave scars that never heal. And if you ever meet Eli, turn away. Run. Because some things are not human.